Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Okay, so today we're going deep on a true crime story.
Oh, I love a good true crime story.
Right, and this one's a cold case from Arizona.
Okay.
And get this. It involves classic cars, a mysterious Ducati motorcycle, like a whole network of fake names, DNA evidence, and a confession years later.
Wow, that's a lot. Where are we getting all this from?
We're using an episode of Anatomy of Murder as our guide. They really break it down well.
Awesome. I'm ready to dive in.
Me too. By the end of this, you'll see how investigators pieced together the clues, navigated all these dead ends. And trust me, there are some real aha moments.
I bet. What always amazes me about these cases is that they often start out seeming so ordinary.
Totally, yeah. Like with this one, it starts off like any other missing persons case, and then boom, it takes this dark turn.
It reminds us how important those early steps in an investigation are.
Exactly, yeah. Like each little detail is like another layer of the mystery. So let's start with our missing couple. Chuck and Kathy. They lived in Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay.
Chuck was a total car enthusiast. Classic Mustangs, motorcycles. He even had this cherry red Ford F-150 truck. Remember that?
Got it. The try.
Right. It'll come back later. And Kathy worked at the county recorder's office.
It's a pretty normal life, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah, totally. Reliable, loved their dog, the whole 9 yards.
So what happened? When did things go sideways?
So it's early February 2002, and they both miss work. Their dog's alone at home. Messages are going unanswered.
Oh.
Yeah, not good. So friends and family are freaking out. They contact the police, and the police go to their house to check on them.
Right.
There are no signs of a struggle at the house, but their dog, Desmo, is there, alone, no food, distressed, and that's really out of character for them. Usually they'd board him if they were going to be away.
That's definitely strange. It sounds like something happened suddenly, unexpectedly.
Right. And then, get this, separate missing persons reports are filed for Chuck and Kathy.
So they weren't together. That's a red flag for sure.
It immediately raised suspicions for investigators.
I bet. Like, was this planned? Did they run off separately? Or is there something more sinister going on?
Exactly. So early on, investigators get a lead. Chuck had just sold a classic Mustang.
Ah, could this be it? Maybe a deal gone wrong.
That's what they thought. So they tracked down everyone who responded to the ad for the car, including the guy who actually bought it. And guess what? He's back in San Diego, totally legit purchase, completely cleared.
Also a dead end.
Total dead end. But then another clue pops up.
Okay, what is it?
A motorcycle shop owner remembers Chuck talking about buying a Ducati in Tucson. He said he found it in a newspaper ad, a really good deal, all cash.
Interesting. So maybe it was a setup. Like someone was trying to lure him in with a fake deal?
That's what it's starting to look like. The police check out the ad, and it's completely bogus. Fake names, addresses, phone numbers, the whole thing traced back to a burner phone.
Wow, so someone was really planning this out.
Right. This isn't just some random thing. Then, just days after Chuck and Kathy disappear, remember that cherry red F-150?
The truck, yeah?
It's found abandoned over 100 miles away in Tucson, in a church parking lot of all places.
Whoa. Okay, so that really expands the scope of this whole thing. Why Tucson? Did they drive there willingly, or were they taken?
Right. So many questions. Inside the truck, they find a motorcycle helmet, Chuck's checkbook, and his gun, the one he kept for protection.
So some of his things are there, but not all of them.
Exactly. The tie-down straps he bought at the motorcycle shop, the ones you'd need for a Ducati, those are missing.
It's like pieces of a puzzle, but we're still missing a lot of them.
Okay, so now forensics gets involved, right? No fingerprints inside the truck like someone wiped it down, but they get DNA samples from several places. The armrest, the turn signal, the door handle.
And I'm guessing at first those DNA samples didn't lead anywhere.
You guessed it. Dead end. Years go by, no solid leads, and the case goes cold.
How frustrating. For the families, for the investigators, to have no answers.
I know. It's like Chuck and Kathy just vanished. But then in 2009, that DNA from the truck, it finally gets a hit. And the name that comes back is Brian Ferry.
Okay, so now we have a name. But what took so long? 7 years. Was it a missed opportunity?
It's definitely a question that lingers, but hold on, because this is where things get really interesting. We'll dive into Brian Ferry and what happens next in part 2. So we ended part 1 with that DNA hit, Brian Ferry. Finally, a name after all these years.
7 years, if I remember correctly. It makes you wonder how many other cold cases might be out there just waiting for that one crucial piece of evidence to surface.
Right. And in this case, it's Detective Fuller, a former detective who's now working at the Pima County DA's office, who picks up the Brian Ferry thread. He starts digging into Ferry's background, and you know what he finds.
What's that?
Ferry has this history of stealing vehicles. He'd answer ads for cars for sale, take them for a test drive, and then poof, disappear with the car.
Uh-huh. So this guy's a con artist. Fits the Ducati scenario perfectly.
Right. And get this, police actually interviewed Ferry back in 2002.
Wait, what? Before they even knew about the DNA match?
Exactly. It was for a totally different scam, some housing fraud thing. They even went to his house.
No way.
And during that interview, Ferry mentioned something about ripping up the carpet with his dad.
Interesting. I mean, it sounds like a random detail, but you never know. It could be significant.
Right. And with Ferry's history of cons, it was enough for Detective Fuller to take a second look. Years later, he contacts the new owners of the house, gets permission to go inside.
What did he find?
He finds these patched up holes in the walls, and between the studs, a bullet.
Whoa. Okay, now we're talking.
And not just any bullet. It was a .45 caliber HK bullet. Now remember, Ferry owned a .45 caliber HK pistol that he bought in 2001 and then later sold. He was also linked to a rifle of the same caliber, so either could have fired that bullet.
Okay, but do they know for sure if it was his gun?
That's where things get a little tricky. The serial number on the paperwork for the rifle didn't match up, so it's not a perfect match.
But still, it's a pretty big coincidence, right? Wrong serial number or not, Ferry owned the same type of gun that fired that bullet, and it was found in a house he lived in. Plus, his DNA is in Chuck's truck, and he's got this history of running scams. Starting to feel like a pretty solid case against him.
You'd think, right. But there's still that one massive problem. No bodies, no proof that Chuck and Kathy are even dead, let alone how they died. So the case is at a standstill again. Years go by.
It must have been agonizing for the families not knowing what happened to their loved ones.
It's 2014, 12 years since Chuck and Kathy disappeared. And then out of nowhere, the case takes this totally unexpected turn.
What happened? Did they finally find the bodies?
No! Get this. A guy walks into a police station, wants to turn himself in.
For what?
For arguing with a significant other. But while he's confessing, he drops a bombshell. He tells the police that years ago, his son confessed to him about killing 2 people.
Hold on. Are we talking about?
Yep. John Ferry, Brian Ferry's father. He told police that back in 2002, Brian called him to that same house, the one where they found the bullet, and asked for help getting rid of some stuff.
Stuff? What kind of stuff?
Brian claimed it was large palm tree trunks wrapped in tarps. So John helps him load them up, and they drive to the city dump.
Wow. I mean, talk about a curveball. But can they trust this confession? What if the father's just trying to protect his son?
That's a good question. But there are a few things that support John Ferry's story. It was unsolicited. I mean, he didn't have to say anything about his son. He just volunteered it while confessing to a totally unrelated crime.
That does add some credibility, doesn't it? Like, why bring it up at all unless it was weighing on him?
Right. Plus, he got really emotional during his confession, and the details he gave seemed to match up with what they already knew about the case. And think about it, he kind of incriminates himself by admitting he helped dispose of those palm tree trunks.
Okay, that's true. It's not like he's trying to make himself look innocent.
So, because of John Ferry's confession, the missing persons case officially becomes a homicide investigation, 13 years after they vanished.
Wow, 13 years. It's hard to fathom how Chuck and Kathy's families must have felt during all that time.
I know, and they still don't have their loved ones' bodies.
Which must make it even harder to find any closure.
But at least they had a suspect. But how do you prosecute a murder case without a body? That's the challenge Nicole Green, the prosecutor for cold cases, was facing.
No body cases are notoriously tough to prosecute. You have to prove the victims are actually dead, determine how they died, all without the physical evidence you'd normally have.
And remember, it's all circumstantial evidence. No one saw Chuck and Kathy with Ferry. No murder weapon was ever found.
So what was Green's strategy? How did she approach this?
She decided to focus on painting a complete picture of Brian Ferry. She wanted to show the jury his past behavior, his history of scams, the fake ad for the Ducati. She also highlighted the bullet in the wall, John Ferry's confession, and emphasized that there had been zero activity from Chuck and Kathy since they disappeared.
Smart. She's basically building a narrative that points to Ferry, even without a body.
Exactly. But what about the defense? What was their angle?
Well, the defense would have been trying to create reasonable doubt. They could have argued that there's no actual proof that Chuck and Kathy are dead. Maybe they just decided to disappear on their own. They also would have tried to discredit John Ferry's confession, Maybe portray him as an unreliable witness?
So the first trial happens, and it ends in a mistrial.
That's tough. But sometimes it happens, especially in complicated cases like this one.
But Nicole Green isn't giving up. For the second trial, she refines her approach. This time, she really focuses on the premeditation, the fact that Ferry seemed to have planned this whole thing out, and she introduces new evidence.
Oh, what kind of evidence?
She brings in a handwriting expert who testifies that the handwriting on the money order used for the fake motorcycle ad shows signs of being disguised, like Ferry was trying to cover his tracks from the very beginning.
Wow, that's a great detail. Really adds to the whole picture of a planned con.
And the second time around, it works. The jury convicts Brian Ferry on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Justice served right.
It sounds like it.
Uh,
But hold on, I have a feeling there's more to this story.
you're right. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with the final part of this incredible story. So, Brian Ferry, convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Seems like the end of the story, right? Except,
There's always a twist. What happened? Did they finally find Chuck and Gathy's bodies?
nope. Sadly, the bodies were never found. And to make things even more complicated, just before sentencing, Ferry takes his own life in jail.
Oh, wow. So he was convicted, but ultimately he escaped any real punishment.
Yeah. And he robbed the families of a final confession, of ever knowing for sure what happened to Chuck and Kathy.
It's a heartbreaking end to an already tragic story. All because of a con that went way too far. It makes you think what started as a potential car theft ended up costing 2 people their lives.
Right. It really shows how greed and deception can escalate into something so horrific.
And it highlights how sometimes justice is just out of reach.
Hmm.
Even with a conviction, there's no real closure for the families.
It's a tough pill to swallow. I mean, think about everything we've learned about this case. It started as a missing persons case, then turned into this whole web of scams and cons. Then we have a bullet hidden in a wall, a confession from the suspect's father, and finally, a conviction. But in the end, there are still so many unanswered questions.
It's definitely a case that stays with you, and it raises so many questions about the justice system, of how we handle no-body murder cases.
Exactly. Could Ferry have been convicted without his father's confession? Would the lack of a body have made it impossible to prove his guilt?
It's hard to say for sure. But this case definitely shows how crucial circumstantial evidence can be. And it underscores how dedicated investigators and prosecutors, like Detective Fuller and Nicole Green, can be the difference between a cold case staying cold and finally achieving some measure of justice, even if it's not the outcome everyone was hoping for.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. We've seen how even carefully planned crimes can leave a trail of evidence, how seemingly small details can be critical in solving a case, and how persistence can pay off even years later.
And we've learned how forensic science, especially DNA analysis, has revolutionized investigations. It's amazing to think that a tiny sample collected from a truck in 2002 could lead to a conviction in 2014.
So we've talked a lot about the evidence, the legal strategy, the twists and turns of this case. But in the end, it's a story about 2 people, Chuck and Kathy, who vanished without a trace. Their lives were cut short, and their families were left with a void that can never truly be filled.
It's a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of crime.
We hope that by sharing their story, we can shed light on the complexities of no-body murder cases and encourage continued discussion about the pursuit of justice, even in the most challenging circumstances. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.